Okay, welcome everybody to our August session of Doctor Integration Office Hours. This month we'll be covering advanced caching in TCI Connect. We have our usual disclaimer. I think the main thing here for the disclaimer is, we're going to show you some tips and tricks that you can use for advanced caching, performance, better advanced use of our variables, tools, and mapper connections. But your mileage may vary, this you should test and benchmark anything for your particular integrations. All right. So for the agenda today, we want to review the variables, tools, and mapper. Then we'll look at rolling your own lookup cache. We'll go over collections, iterations, and pagination, and how do we do these when these are not functions that are native to TCI Connect. Okay, so variables, tools, and mapper, these are part of our connector extensions. And these are connectors which don't actually interface to any particular endpoint. It's not like SQL Server or Salesforce, where you're actually connecting to a data source. What these connectors do is they leverage the functionality of .NET and add additional, they leverage .NET to add additional functionality to TCI Connect. Now, TCI Connect itself is written in .NET. And if you understand how things work under the hood and sort of the architecture of the system, we have our general map designer, and then the map designer connects to particular endpoints that you enter the credentials into. And once you have those endpoints, it presents you with the metadata and the entities and the operations for those endpoints. Now, because that is just a contract between what we call the core flow designer and the actual endpoint, and it's written in .NET, you can do any sort of .NET functionality. So what we've done is we've created some connector extensions. One of them is called variables, and the variables is a single key value pair store that stores data into memory, and that can be used either by the scope of that is that it's useful to store values when you're in some type of inner loop. Say you're looping through some records using a fetch, and you want to store some values, or you want to store some values that you store in one record and then use somewhere down the line at a subsequent record as you're looping through them. All right. The tools connector, in this case, tools connector, we're only going to be using the tools connector for the select one. And if you think about how a map generally works in TCI Connect, the outer query block returns an array of records, and then the map loops through this array of records, and then each of those records gets operated on. What the select one does is allows us to create a single dummy record that we can just execute the entire program one time through. And if we want to use inner loops in that to loop through other records, we use a fetch, and we'll see how this is useful. Now the mapper, and there's already a lot of great resources on this in our help, as well as in the marketplace. There are some sample apps that you can use for variables, tools, and mapper. So if you're not familiar with those, really spend some time going there, understanding how these work, understanding the different ways you can use them. And once you do, I think you'll see it provides a lot of additional power. Now, what we're doing here in this case is actually combining these three different connector extensions to do some sort of advanced functionality, right? And for the mapper, what the mapper does is it serializes and deserializes JSON. And the way that that's worked on is within the connection itself. Let's head over to TCI, and let's just check to see what these connections look like for these particular types. All right. So under our connections tab, once we've logged in, we will see and selected integration. We see our list of apps. Okay. And then we head over to our connections. And we can see what these mapper connections look like let's look at the variables one. The variables one is the variables and tools are probably some of the simplest of all. So these are single parameter connections because all they are is essentially exposing some .NET functionality via our connector interface, right? And in this case, it doesn't really matter. These work on both cloud and on-premise agents. And I'm just calling, this is type variables, and it's just the name of this is variables. So of course, in order to get this first, you head over to the marketplace. You want to go and activate these, mapper, you can search for the ones you want. And of course, that's the typical way to get into it, right? Now for the tools, it's similar in that there's just a single connector, single parameter, which is just the name of the connector. Right? And that's all pretty straightforward here. Now the mapper gives us some additional functionality, and here's how the mapper works. So I've created a mapper connection. First, I activated the marketplace, then I created a connection called, I call it mapper-CDM. And CDM for me stands for common data model. So what I've done here is I've created a mapper connection. And in the mapper connection, you need to define each entity separately. And the key thing here is that, in fact, let me open up a text editor. I can show you what these look like here. All right, so here's what it looks like in the text editor. Hold on, let me bring it to the right screen. Okay, so this is basically just a simple JSON sample of our contact schema. Okay. Now, if you want that same entity as an array, you actually have to call it. You have to give it a separate entity and create it as an array. Now, it is possible within the mapper to create nested JSON. So if that's a very complicated nested JSON, I could populate it here, and then all of the different levels would be exposed within the map itself when we went to go use it. But in this case here, we have the. So if we are using an array, even though it's the same exact thing, we have to actually specify it as an array. And the same thing here, I have a user entity, I have a user list, and I have a company entity and a company list entity. And this is just something that I'm using with my, for the examples, and I'm just calling this a common data model because it's a place where I can just store some entities that are pretty common across most integrations. All right. So that's how we create these connections that we're going to use. The other connection we're going to use is HTTP, and HTTP is a way to send out data to endpoints with outside of any schema. So what you end up doing is you assemble a body, and usually that body is going to be some JSON, and then you give it the URL that you want to send it to, and then you just do whatever operation you want, post, get, whatever it is. Okay. And the same thing with HTTP is there are no parameters associated with it. Also in this, we have a very simple text file as a target that I use for examples up in Dropbox. And Dropbox is a great place to put, if you only have cloud agents, you don't have any place for on-premise, Dropbox is a great place you can use to store files if you want to write things out and test things. So we can see here, what you do normally is you activate this in the marketplace, of course, you authenticate the connection, and you head over to the entities, and then you can enter in all the fields one by one for these entities. And we see here that this is just a sample contact entity that we're going to be using within this workshop. All right. So let's just quickly go over some of the ways that we use variables and the mapper in HTTP. So the first one, this is an example that we've seen in previous workshops and that I teach in level 2 training. And this is a map. I want to show this to you because it has some of the standard practices for using the variables connector. So what we see here is we have this query contact, which brings back an array of records. And we know that the way that this works is for every record in this array, every record that gets returned, it's going to execute all of these blocks for that one record. Now, the first thing we do here is we initialize the particular variables that we want. And in this case, variables are a key value pair, simple name string, and then depending on what type of variable it is the entity name. So for a integer variable, we use this entity int variable. We can see the other ones that we have here. So if we're using a Boolean, we select this. For string, we select this. Okay. What we do in this case is we initialize these to either 0 or null, so that at the beginning of each record, as we're looping through, we know that these values are going to be set to a known value. Right. Then what we do is we have this inner loop here, this fetch tickets, and this fetch tickets are going to select all the tickets / cases for this particular contact. Right. And then what we do is there's a lookup and then upsert. There's a lookup and then an upsert operation, and then a comparison that will set the new values for this variable. So we see we have this outside of this loop, we have these initialization of these three variables. And then here we look up the count, we look up the max date, we look up and we increment the count, right? And then here, if the date is greater, if the date of the record in this ticket is greater than the max date that we've already saved, then we upsert a new max date, we upsert the ticket ID here. All right. So we have this initialization, lookup, update. And then once we're outside of this loop, then we do an additional lookup to pull the final values for these variables. And then in this case here, we update this final record here. But what we do in this case, for this particular if operation here, is if date is greater than max date, and we're going to see this. So I'm showing things. We're going to see this pattern a lot in terms of using some type of condition and then conditionally updating the variables here. So this condition here is pretty straightforward. We've covered the edge case. If when we initialize the max date, it ends up with a null value. So if it's null or empty, we know that that's the first one. Or if it's a previously initialized record and the modified date of that record is greater than the one that we just did a lookup on, then we update the value of the variable using our upsert block. And basically with variables, there's two things we're using. We're using upsert and we're using lookup. Query and fetch aren't really applicable in this situation, so we don't need to worry about them. And then now once we're out of this loop, we do an additional lookup to get the actual final values. And then here, when we update the contact, we can see what this looks like. Just a pretty simple, we're just putting the last ticket date and last ticket ID in the contact record at the top level. All right. That's pretty straightforward in how we use variables. Right. Now let's look at how it works, how the mapper works. So in this case, in this particular map here, what we're doing is we're looping through all of our contact records. And this is a schema that's in our database. If you've attended some of these other workshops or attended the level 2 training, I have a simple ERP database that's similar to like a Salesforce, very, very pared down, has contacts, leads, companies, tickets, right? Activities, things like that. Just a very, very basic system for examples. In this case, what we do is we loop through our contact, all right? And then what we do here is we use the mapper to serialize our contact record into JSON. And how does this actually work? Well, just like every block, we need to select the block type. In this case, it's serialized, and we need to select the entity. And what does this really do? When we say serialized contact, well, this is a single object. So it's going to create create JSON, which is in the format of what was ever entered into the connection. So the connection screen parameters is where you enter the sample JSON, and then you select the entity by which it's going to serialize the JSON as, right? This is pretty straightforward here. What does serialization look like? So these are the entity. This is the entity that was created. All the different fields. If we go back to our connection screen, we'll see these fields. But if you do notice one thing here, I gave these fields the same name, the same exact names as the contact. And what that allows me to do is use the smart mapper. So for smart mapper, what you do is on the left-hand side, you select which entity you want to use. In this case, there's only one. You select the entity here, and then you head over here, you select all, hit smart mapper, and it's going to map all the fields that are the same names. And it also will map fields that are similar names too. But I did that on purpose, so when I actually did the mapping here, it would map 1-to-1. All right. So now what this block does here is it creates a chunk of JSON, and now we can use that JSON somewhere else. And what we do here in this case is we do a post operation. And what does this look like here? Well, let's check it out. Pretty straightforward. We have the content, which is the output of this block. And what this output is here is this is actually one big JSON string. So mapper output is a big string of JSON. That's the content. And then it's application JSON type. And this is actually another scribe map, which will process this and add it to another database. And we can see what that looks like here by heading over to, that's what this looks like, right? So we use our HTTP also to receive a message, and this lookup actually parses it. So the lookup operation, what it does, and fetch works in a similar way. Lookup operation will take the input, which is just the body of whatever came over, the content, and it parses it against, parses it using this schema. And now once it parses it using that schema, then we can update our contact in whatever text file we want to do. And what comes out of the lookup operation are all these fields here: first name, last name, ID, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So that's how the mapper works. The mapper will serialize as JSON, and then on the opposite end of the spectrum, it will parse as JSON. This is very useful if we want to do things like create our own messaging system. We could use the messaging subsystem to read records from one, push it into another, or we can just create our own JSON and push it into whatever endpoint we have. But if push it to whatever endpoint we want to using HTTP, because it has the benefit of not requiring a Swagger definition. All right. Okay, and now this is similar. The array works in a similar way, but I want to show you what the I want to show you how. Give me a second for this to log on. It is being slow. I don't know why. Okay, it seemed to not like my screen. Let's try it again. Okay. So no, what we do in this case, previously we noticed as we were looping through, we sent out an HTTP post for every single record that we in the actual database. Now here, what we're doing is we're doing a couple things different here. We want to demonstrate in this map so you can understand how we're using the select one, as well as how we are serializing and creating a JSON array, and also how we send out that array as a single post operation. So with the select one, we see that what happens is all these blocks are only executed one time through. So any loops that we need to operate on, we need to use some type of fetch. So the first thing we do use select one. We know that all these operations can be executed one time. So first thing is we initialize the serialization. We want to serialize some JSON, but because it's an array, we need to do a couple things. First, we head over to the include tab, and then we want to include the array of records. So basically, anytime you have any sort of nested JSON, you want to open up your include and check all these that you're going to be using. Then what we do is we fetch through all the contacts, and this is equivalent to the lookup operation in the previous map where we just loop through all the contacts. Now what we do is for each record in our contact, we add this as an element to the array, and we can see that that's what this does here. This serializes a way for us to create an array. Individual records are added to the array with this add, and then you would select the relationship that you had previously exposed up in your serialized block here. All right. So what's the net result here? The net result is the output of this serialization contact list block is an array of contact records. Now what I do is I do a post operation and I send it to a different endpoint that we'll look at, see how it works. And this endpoint is we take the output from the mapper, which is just a big string, just a string of JSON, and then we send it to this URI, and this URI is going to parse it accordingly and use it accordingly. Right? Now that could be any endpoint which accepts JSON. We'll just see how to reverse that operation using TCI Connect. And the way that operation gets reversed is like this. So we do a similar thing. What we do is, hold on, we want to use the array, process array. So what we do in this case is we wait for the message, we do a fetch, and in the fetch, we use the same filter. And basically what this does is the filter in this, we send the body of the content to the map input, and the output is whatever schema we've chosen. In this case, the output is an array. So what we need to do here is we need to loop through the array and then do an upsert on each one of these. All right. So that's how it would look on the other end of that. Okay. So we've gone through some sort of our standard examples for using our variables connector and understanding our mapper, both in terms of both for using arrays as well as individual object records. Okay, great. Now let's look at, let's head back to our slide deck, because the next slide we want to cover is roll your own lookup caching. So we're going to do a couple things here. I'm going to be showing you a bunch of different programming tricks that you can use, not only for these examples, but also for integrations in general. So of course, the first thing we want to take a step back is and think about performance when we're using lookups. So if we're looping through some records and we do a lookup on a parent object, say we're looping through some contact records, we do a lookup on the on the owner of that record or the last modified by user to get information about the user, say that user's name. Every time we do that lookup, we incur an API hit. And if we're looping through 1,000 records, that's an additional 1,000 API hits, right? So what we wanted, and now there's caching operations. We can use joins, we can use caching, and there's a lot of information about this in the level 2 training, and I think also online in terms of the best practices. So best practices to limit the amount of lookups that you're doing to reduce the number of API calls is to use lookup caching whenever possible, and also joins. So when you retrieve a record, you're also going to retrieve its parent and child record relationships at the same time. But we want to show you a different way of doing this. Say you have a lot of records, or there's more records than you'd be able to store in a cache, because lookup caching only has a finite storage space, or there's some other reasons you want to try some other reasons that you're finding that you're not getting the performance you need. What we're going to do is we're going to roll our own lookup caching. So the first thing we want to do is simulate an initialization routine. So if you look at the map design, look at the map flow, we see that our maps, let's jump right into this example. We see that our maps that query an entity are going to loop through this entity, all right? But there's no way to necessarily initialize to have an initialization routine, which we might want to, and that's what we want to simulate here. So the initialization routine is simulated by using an if block with the recnum equals 1. So we're going to simulate this initialization routine. Then we're going to query all the records for the entity that we want to cache out. For each record, we're going to serialize it as JSON. Then we're going to store it as a variable using the ID and using the ID as the key and the JSON as the value. All right. Now, in our previous example, when we used a variable, we gave it a static name as a string: date, count, maximum date, record ID. Right. In this case, we're actually, the ID itself is going to be a variable. We don't know what it is. It's just going to be a variable, and then we'll use it later on. So the key thing to remember, the key thing about the variables connector is that it is a single key value pair. There's no iterations with it. There's no way to iterate. There's no way to, there's no collections involved. It's just a single global variable key value pair. Right? So what we have to do in this case is we have this initialization routine. We use this if first record. This is a conditional, which says rec number equals 1. And it's important to put this at the very top of our block. So this initialization should come before any processing you're going to do that's specific to this record. Then what we do is we have this fetch block, which essentially returns all the users. Now, why does this save us time? Well, this fetch is going to return based upon the pagination of the endpoint. So instead of doing an individual, say we had 10,000 users, all right, if we could end up with doing 10,000 lookups if we did some type of lookup caching, but this fetch is going to bring back by the page size. So say it was 100 records per page size. Well, now that's only 100 API calls. Right? So if we were using the built-in caching, it would still require potentially 10,000 API calls to fill the cache. In this case, we know it's going to be 100 API calls because we're actually just pulling back the entire table. Then what we do is we serialize it, basically just create some JSON. We have our user record here. We're going to convert it to JSON, and we're using our mapper. And just like we saw in our previous example, pretty straightforward. We selected our user on here. We did the auto link, and now this is all the fields that are in our user common data model that we have as JSON. Now the key thing here is we store this in memory using the variables. How does that work? Well, user underscore toString the ID, all right, and then the mapper is going to be the value is the output. Right? So now what we've done here is we've basically written out, and this is how we can sort of simulate a collection too. A collection where we have say we wanted to do multiple ones. Say you wanted to do users and accounts. We could fetch the users, cache it in, and put the value as user underscore. We could put accounts, account underscore. Now what we do is we do the lookup. We pull it back out. The lookup criteria is going to be the reverse. Okay. we concatenate the owner ID. And if you look at what the contact record is, let's just look at what the contact record is for this map here. So the contact has created by, which is the key that points to the user record, modified by an owner ID. Typical thing you'd see in any type of system, right? So we do this case is we retrieve it, and this step pulls it out of memory. What do we have? Now we have the JSON. So we parse the JSON based upon the mapper input, and based upon we take the output from the variable as the mapper input, and that sends it to the mapper, and it parses it based upon the user schema. So we stored these as JSON, and now we're retrieving it, and we serialized JSON and stored it. Now we're retrieving it, and then we just doing this for each one of these. Now all these are coming out of memory, so it's going to be a very fast operation. And at the end, what we do here is we just create this contact flat, and this is just another sample where we have created by name, and this is, we see what this is. What is this? This is the what does this look like? This is the mapper first name space created by mapper last name. So we're just pulling those two fields out. And again, anytime you're doing these lookups, you can use a lookup or a fetch if it's a single object. If it's a multi-level object, you have to use a fetch because you have to select all the nested JSON. And once you do this lookup operation here, this field list, you should always select all, sorry, for this field list here, once we parse it, this parse is actually a lookup operation. And again, what it does is it sends the entire JSON string as the input, and then it brings back these fields. So you can always just do a select all there to pull back all those fields. All right. So this is our example of rolling your own lookup cache here. And again, we could use additional tables here. We could fetch users, we could fetch accounts, we could fetch tickets. There's a bunch of different things we could do, right? In fact, we may decide we want to query the tickets and then pre-cache our users, our contacts, our accounts. Now, because variables under the hood, it's just a hash collection. It's just a dictionary inside of .NET. It's actually extraordinarily efficient, and it will store a lot of records. When I was helping the dev team put this together, I did some testing for them, and I pushed in a couple million records into the variables, and it worked fine. If you think about it, even if it's like 50 bytes, a couple million records is only 50 megabytes total, right? So it doesn't really take up a lot of space in memory. So you don't have to worry. So you're probably never going to really probably never going to really reach the extent to, run out of memory, reach the extent of what it can do for you, all right? Okay, so we've given our review of variables. We understand now, I think at a deeper level, how the mapper works. It basically just serializes things to and from JSON, all right? Now we're going to work to the next level, and we're going to think about how to use collections, iterations, and pagination, all right? So in our example where we created an array of JSON that we sent out to an endpoint, well, what happens if that's just too big? What happens if that works if there's a couple thousand records? What happens if there's millions and millions of records? We're going to need to break that up. You just send out fewer API calls. So it's sort of like a batch operation, right? Like the first example sent individual records out. The second example sent all the records out as one big batch. But if too many records, you're going to exceed what a reasonable batch size is. So what we want to do is we want to simulate how to do that within making API calls using iteration and pagination on a collection of records. Okay, so that's because the variable connector again lacks these abilities. So the first thing we're going to do is going to create this collection. We're going to loop through all the records in our entity, and for each one of them, we're going to serialize it as JSON. But instead of making the key the ID, we're going to make the key just a count, right? So if the entity is user, it's going to be the first record to be user 1, the second record to be user 2, user 3, user 4, and then once we know how many users we have, we'll get our total number of users by accumulating a count as we loop through it, right? And then afterwards, we can unroll that process. If we know we have 717 users, right, and each one is in the keys are user 1 through user 717, now we know that we can loop through those and retrieve those as an iteration, right? So we're basically just leveraging math to do an iteration. Okay. And now we're going to use a couple loops so we can work with the pagination on that. So the outer loop is going to break after all the records. So we're going to have an inner loop, which is going to parse and use the pagination. Let's see how this looks all together. Okay. So in this case, we are going to have use our select one, all right? And we're going to start from the top here and kind of walk through all these different pieces. So the first thing we do is we initialize our total and our page size. This page size is just going to be whatever the total records are we send out, all right? Then we loop through, we use a fetch to get all of our contacts, right? And what we do, we have the same pattern again, where we look up the total. So we get the total out of as a variable out of memory, then we increment it. Then for each contact, we're going to serialize it. So this serialized contact creates JSON. And then what we do is we store that in memory using this formula here. So we take the output, which is JSON, contact, and variable lookup total, which is just the number that comes out, right? Now, once we've gone through this loop, now we have a couple things. We have a total number of contacts, and we have all those contacts individually stored as key value pairs in memory that we can retrieve in order. Now what we do is we look up the contact, we get the page, and if the total number is 0, right? Say this, we initialize this as 0, say we have to fetch contacts and there were none. I just broke out. This just exits the map as the edge case. All right. Now what we do is we initialize our count because we're going to start with 0. We're going to loop through until we have processed all the records. And we have two loops. We have an outer loop, which we're going to break out of once we've reached all the records. And then we have this inner loop, which we break out of once we've reached the page size. Right. And this is where we do two things. We do a few things inside here. So the output of this block is going to be a serialized JSON of the page size with an array of JSON records with the number of records in that array as the page size, or if it's the last one, it'll be that one. Then we have this loop. We do the same thing, retrieve the contact, we increment the contact. Then in this get contact number, we actually retrieve the contact from memory using this lookup criteria. And it's the contact plus the count value, right? And now once we have that, then we parse this JSON, right? And then we add it to the list array. In fact, we probably could have just added it right to the list array. I don't think we needed to parse it again, come to think of it, because if it's the same entity, I just could have added it right here. But in this case, we parse it and then we add it to the list array, and we use this if block here to break out. And if it's either the end or it's one of the page values, if the count is a mod of the page value, which we know it's a page size, then we break out. And when we break out, immediately afterwards, we do the send. And the send is the fields for this. We're just going to send this out to our endpoint, and we're going to use this, which is an array of JSON with those number of records. And then we get the count again outside here. If it's the final number of records we loop, we exit the array. Otherwise, we go back to this loop here, and we do the process over again. All right. So what does that really entail? It entails first looping through, getting initial total, and then using another inner and outer loop to be able to, the inner loop is going to break once you reach a page size, and the outer loop finally breaks once you reach the end of the records. All right. Okay, certainly covered a lot in that session there, but I want to show you understand all the foundational pieces that go into how to do this. And we'll make these maps available and the recording available up on the community page for the Doctor integration page. All right. All right. Any questions? Okay, everybody, thank you for your time. Look forward to next month. We'll be going over some of the new monitoring that we have for Bridge BusinessWorks and Flogo in TCI. So be sure to sign up for that, and we'll see you next month. Thanks.